One afternoon after a work assignment, a small line of prisoners was called forward one by one, and instead of tools or instructions, each man was handed a few coins and a simple note explaining the amount, and several of them stared at the money in silence because none of them had expected to be paid while still behind barbed wire. The moment stayed in their minds because it did not fit the logic they had carried with them since capture, as most of these men associated prisoner life with restriction and dependence rather than any form of personal earning. So when the coins were placed into their hands along with a short explanation delivered through a translator, the reaction was not excitement but careful attention, since soldiers trained by years of war rarely accepted unusual gestures at face value. The translator explained that prisoners assigned to certain work details could receive small payments according to regulations, and that the money was recorded and limited in how it could be used, which immediately signaled that this was a system rather than a spontaneous decision. The coins themselves were modest in value and sometimes issued as camp scrip rather than regular currency. And the difference mattered because it meant the money functioned within the camp environment instead of the outside economy. Yet even with those limits, the idea of earning something personal created a quiet shift in how the men viewed their daily tasks. Work had previously been seen only as obligation or routine, but now it carried a measurable outcome, even if small, and measurable outcomes help people understand structure. Many of the prisoners had come from units where labor during wartime meant survival rather than compensation. So linking work to payment felt unfamiliar, and some initially assumed the money might be symbolic or temporary, while others wondered whether it would later be deducted or restricted further, reflecting the cautious mindset formed by unpredictable conditions earlier in the war. No one spoke loudly about it. Yet the low conversations in the barracks that evening showed how closely the men were thinking about this detail. The camp authorities maintained records carefully, writing down names, hours, and amounts with a precision that resembled civilian administration more than battlefield improvisation. And this record-keeping reinforced the idea that the system followed rules tied to international agreements. Since prisoner treatment was governed by conventions many soldiers had heard about, but rarely expected to experience in such practical form. Seeing their names entered into a ledger gave the process a formal tone that reduced suspicion and replaced it with analytical curiosity. Some prisoners handled the coins thoughtfully, turning them in their fingers as if testing their reality, because physical objects often make abstract rules feel concrete, and for men separated from their normal lives, even a small personal item could represent a link to individual identity beyond rank and number. The money could be used at the camp canteen for approved goods like toiletries, writing materials, or small comforts, and this limited choice introduced a narrow but meaningful area of decision-making. Decision-making, even in small forms, mattered psychologically, since captivity reduces control over most aspects of life. And having the ability to choose a bar of soap, a notebook, or extra paper for letters created a sense of participation in one's own routine. That sense did not remove the fence or change their status, yet it added a layer of predictability that men could understand. Guards treated the process neutrally, distributing payments without ceremony and moving on to the next task, which signaled that this was administrative rather than generous. And prisoners often read tone as carefully as words, noticing that nothing in the guard's manner suggested reward or punishment, only procedure. Procedure, when repeated consistently, becomes easier to accept because it follows logic rather than mood. By the end of that first week, the idea of pocket money had shifted from surprise to cautious familiarity, and the men began to see it as part of the camp's organized structure, where work, records, and limited compensation formed a system designed to keep daily life orderly. The realization did not create optimism, but it provided clarity, and clarity helps the mind adapt, because understanding how a place operates is the first step in learning how to live within it. As the system continued over the following weeks, the payments no longer felt like a single unusual event, but part of the camp's regular administration, and the prisoners began to notice how closely the process followed schedules and written records. Because certain work groups were called on specific days, their hours were counted, and their names appeared again in the same ledger kept by the administrative staff, which showed that the system relied on documentation rather than verbal promises. And documentation usually signals rules that extend beyond one location or one officer. The types of work that qualified for payment were practical and often connected to the camp's daily functioning, including kitchen assistance, maintenance, laundry support, and agricultural labor outside the inner compound under supervision. And these tasks were not assigned as privileges, but as organized duties that needed to be done regardless. Yet the existence of compensation attached a measurable structure to them, making time and effort part of a recorded exchange rather than an undefined obligation. Some prisoners approached these assignments with purely practical thinking, seeing them as a way to pass time productively, while others calculated how many hours might allow them to obtain small items at the canteen. And these quiet calculations revealed how quickly the human mind adapts to systems where effort connects to outcome, even when the outcome remains modest. No one mistook the system for freedom, but many recognized that understanding it helped them navigate daily life more calmly. The camp canteen itself became a point of quiet interest because it represented one of the few places where limited choice existed, offering approved goods arranged in simple order behind a counter. And although the selection was basic, the act of choosing among options mattered more than the items themselves, since choice restores a small sense of agency in environments where most decisions are made by others. Writing paper, soap, and small personal supplies often carried more psychological value than material worth. Conversations in the barracks sometimes turned to comparisons with earlier periods of the war, when survival had depended on ration cards, barter, or uncertain supply lines. And against that background, the structured payment system felt less like generosity and more like regulation, which many soldiers understood as part of how large institutions manage groups over long periods. This perspective kept expectations realistic and prevented disappointment. A few men also considered how the system benefited the camp authorities, because organized labor supported maintenance and reduced disorder, and linking work to compensation encouraged steady participation without force, creating a balance between requirement and incentive, and this balance reflected administrative logic rather than sentiment. Prisoners trained to analyze systems could see that both sides operated within defined limits. The guards' behavior remained consistent throughout, neither praising nor criticizing participation, and this neutrality reinforced the sense that the payments were procedural, not personal, and procedures tend to feel predictable when applied evenly, which reduced tension among the men. Predictability, even in a restricted environment, can stabilize mood because it replaces uncertainty with routine. Over time, the coins or script themselves became less interesting than the structure behind them, since the real lesson for many prisoners was how the camp functioned through records, schedules, and rules tied to international standards, and seeing those standards applied in daily life helped them form a clearer picture of their situation, one based on observation rather than rumor. That clarity did not change their status, yet it made the environment more understandable, and understanding is often the first step towards psychological adjustment in long-term confinement. As the payment routine continued, the prisoners gradually stopped focusing on the coins themselves and began paying more attention to how the system influenced daily behavior. Because whenever a structure connects time, work, and recorded outcomes, people naturally adjust their habits around it. And in this case, the men noticed that those assigned to paid details often arrived on time, completed tasks carefully, and kept track of their hours with quiet precision, not out of enthusiasm, but out of practicality, since clear systems reward predictability. This did not create competition in the usual sense, because the opportunities were limited and rotated among groups. Yet it did introduce a subtle awareness of how effort was measured, and measured effort feels different from undefined labor, especially for soldiers who had experienced periods where work and survival blurred together without clear boundaries. Here, even within captivity, the link between task and recorded value gave structure to time. Some prisoners began to treat work assignments as mental anchors in the week, remembering which days involved kitchen duty or outdoor maintenance. And these anchors helped break long stretches of similar days into smaller segments, which matters psychologically because the human mind handles measured time more easily than endless time. A scheduled duty can make a week feel organized rather than empty. During quieter moments, a few men discussed how similar systems existed in civilian life before the war, where hours and wages shaped routine, and these comparisons connected present experience with familiar ideas, reducing the sense of disorientation that often comes with capture and relocation. Familiar concepts, even in restricted form, help people adapt without needing to approve of their situation. The canteen visits also became more orderly, with prisoners planning purchases in advance instead of deciding impulsively. And this planning showed how quickly people apply normal habits to limited environments, since budgeting and saving are behaviors learned long before captivity. The items remained simple, yet the act of planning gave them personal relevance. Guards continued to supervise calmly, ensuring that transactions followed rules and that records matched distributions, and this steady oversight emphasized that the system functioned on accountability, not discretion, which again pointed to regulation rather than generosity. Prisoners who watched closely could see that consistency mattered to the administrators as much as to the men receiving payment. No one confused these small earnings with independence, because the boundaries of the camp remained clear, yet the structure introduced a predictable exchange that fit into the broader routine of meals, roll calls, and rest periods, forming another layer in the daily pattern. Patterns, once recognized, reduce mental strain because they replace guesswork with expectation. By this stage, the payment system had become just another understood part of camp life, neither surprising nor emotional, and its significance lay less in the value of the coins and more in what it revealed about how the camp operated, showing that even in wartime confinement, administration often relied on organized frameworks rather than improvisation. For the prisoners, observing these frameworks provided insight into their environment, and insight helps people orient themselves, even when they cannot change their circumstances. As the weeks continued and the payment system remained steady, the prisoners began to see it less as a curiosity and more as one piece of the larger structure that organized their days, because by now they had experienced enough repetition to recognize that the camp functioned through schedules, records, and clearly defined procedures. And when procedures stay consistent, people learn how to move within them without constant uncertainty. This did not make captivity easier, but it made it more understandable. The men noticed that work assignments rotated in a predictable way, allowing different groups to participate over time, and this rotation prevented the system from feeling selective, which mattered in a closed environment where fairness influences morale. When everyone knew that turns would come again, tension stayed lower, and the atmosphere remained calm rather than competitive. Calm environments tend to be easier for administrators to manage and for prisoners to endure. Some prisoners developed small personal systems, quietly noting how many work periods they had completed or how much script they had saved for future canteen visits. And these quiet calculations gave them a sense of continuity from one week to the next. Continuity matters in confinement because it connects today with tomorrow, creating a thread of time instead of isolated days. At the same time, the limits of the system remained clear, since the money could not be used outside approved channels and could not change their status, and this clarity prevented false expectations from forming. The prisoners understood that the purpose was administrative, tied to regulations governing labor and welfare, and viewing it through that lens helped them keep realistic perspectives. Canteen days became orderly moments where men stepped forward, made small purchases, and returned to their barracks without noise or disorder. And these scenes resembled civilian routines in miniature form, showing how normal habits can exist even within strict boundaries. The items themselves were simple, yet the process of choosing and receiving them carried familiar rhythm. Guards and clerks handled the records with steady attention, checking names and amounts carefully, and this careful accounting reinforced that the system relied on documentation rather than memory, which again pointed to regulation. Regulation, when applied evenly, reduces unpredictability, and predictability often stabilizes group behavior. For many prisoners, the most noticeable effect was how these routines divided time, because a week with assigned duties and canteen visits felt structured rather than empty, and structured time moves differently in the mind than unstructured time. Even small markers can help measure long stretches of confinement. By this stage, the payment system had blended into the background of camp life, functioning quietly alongside meals and roll calls, and its presence illustrated how administration shaped daily experience more through organization than through force. Observing that organization gave the prisoners a clearer map of their environment, and having a clear map, even of a limited space, helps people adjust to circumstances they cannot control. As their time in the camp stretched further and the routines repeated week after week, the payment system settled fully into the background of daily life, and most prisoners no longer reacted to it with surprise, because once a system proves consistent, the mind files it under expectation rather than curiosity. The coins or scrip became ordinary objects kept carefully in small personal spaces, not as treasures, but as items with a defined purpose inside a defined system. The men understood by this point that the value was limited and controlled, yet they also recognized that the structure around it reflected how the camp aimed to manage large groups through order rather than improvisation. Order reduces friction in crowded environments, and reduced friction benefits both those enforcing rules and those living under them. This practical understanding replaced earlier speculation with calm observation. Some prisoners developed the habit of saving their earnings for specific items, planning ahead for riding supplies or small necessities. And this planning created a quiet sense of forward thinking, which matters in confinement because it connects present effort to a near future, even if that future remains within the same fences. Small planning can give shape to otherwise repetitive time. Others treated the system with emotional distance, seeing it simply as part of the rules they followed each day, similar to lining up for meals or attending roll call. And this neutral attitude showed how adaptation often works by reducing reaction rather than increasing acceptance. People can adjust to a structure without approving of it. The guards continued their steady supervision, neither encouraging nor discouraging the system beyond what regulations required. And this neutrality reinforced that the payments were administrative tools, not gestures of favor. Administrative tools are meant to function quietly, and quiet systems tend to last longer because they draw less attention. Conversations among the prisoners shifted over time from questioning why the system existed to discussing how to navigate it smoothly. And this shift revealed psychological adjustment, since the mind often moves from analysis to routine once patterns become clear. Routine does not remove uncertainty, but it makes uncertainty easier to carry. The broader reality of captivity remained unchanged, with fences, schedules, and supervision defining their limits. Yet within those limits, the structured exchange of work and small compensation added another predictable layer to daily life. Predictable layers help people measure time, and measuring time helps endurance. By the later stages, many prisoners saw the payment system as a sign that the camp operated within formal guidelines tied to international standards, and whether they thought about those standards directly or not, they could see their effects in everyday procedures. Observing these details gave them a clearer sense of how their environment functioned. In this way, What once seemed unusual became simply another part of the framework surrounding them, showing how quickly humans adapt to organized systems when those systems remain stable. The importance was never in the coins themselves, but in what the structure behind them revealed about how captivity was administered and how daily life was shaped by rules, records, and repetition. In the end, the small payments did not change the prisoner's status, did not open the gates, and did not shorten the war, yet they remained one of those details that challenged expectations, because many of the men had assumed that captivity meant complete dependence with no personal exchange at all. And encountering a regulated system of work and compensation showed them a different model shaped by rules rather than improvisation. That difference did not create comfort, but it created clarity. What began as suspicion slowly turned into practical understanding, since repeated experience proved that the system followed records, schedules, and limits. And when something follows rules consistently, people learn how to read it. Learning how to read an environment helps reduce mental strain because it replaces guessing with observation. For the prisoners, the lesson was not about the value of the coins, but about how structured administration shaped daily life, showing that even in confinement, systems often run on documentation and procedure. Seeing this firsthand helped separate rumor from reality, which mattered in a time when uncertainty was constant. Over time, memories of captivity were built not only from major events, but from small repeated routines like this one, because daily details often define how a period of life is remembered. A ledger, a canteen visit, or a recorded hour of work could become markers of passing weeks. And so this story settles as a quiet example of how adaptation works, showing that even behind fences people continue to observe, compare, and adjust to the systems around them. History is often lived through these ordinary structures, where rules, records, and routine shape the texture of each day, while larger events unfold far beyond the camp. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.